The following program is a production of Tim Jackson, who assumes full responsibility for its content. The content of this program does not represent the views of FCTV, which serves as a forum for community expression and offers TV training, production facilities, and channel time to all Falmouth residents and organizations.
Right now, this is the fourth slide talk in a series. The first two dealt with Quakers, migration to the United States, and settlement in West Falmouth. Those slideshows are available on the West Falmouth Library website, which is westfalmouthlibrary.org. And today, if you haven't already done it, I would like you to go and make sure that you have a tag. Milt, can you hold up your tag so they can all see what it is? And a pen. The purpose of the tag is at the end of the presentation, if you have a question about anything I've said, if you write all those questions on the tag along with your contact information, and then put them back on the table when you leave, I will get back to you personally at some point, I hope, and be able to provide an answer. I'm very much a wash ashore, so I do not have all the answers. My name is Renee Voorhees, and I am circulation desk and then part-time archivist here at the West Falmouth Library. Presenting also today is Susan Carless, and then the director, Lois Hiller, who will be up here at the end of the presentation. But before we get there, I have a few slides to show first. So this is just a thank you to some of the resources that I used, to the local historians, and to Tim Jackson and family, who are recording these series for the West Falmouth Library, so they have been a great asset. So, in the last slide presentation, part one, I gave you some events that was happening internationally during the 1800s. This talk today will be predominantly about 1850 to 1900. So as you take a look at this list, I decided, well, maybe because we are a part of Falmouth, I should highlight some of the things that were going on in Falmouth the same time that we were working and living here in West Falmouth. So they don't correlate exactly, but it's kind of interesting to know that the development of Hog Island, that purchase was a year before they began to develop the land in the Heights. But the Heights were purchased before Hog Island, but development didn't begin there. It began in Chappaquiddick Island. Hog Island was where the farmers kept their livestock. And then when Henry King came in and started buying land over there and parceling out the land, then they built the causeway, and then the houses were built out there. And I've got some slides that will show you that. Okay. And then I've also put closed, when things closed, when they opened and closed. And in 1886, I thought this was interesting, Falmouth celebrated its bicentennial. 3,000 people attended. I'd be surprised if we got 3,000 people to attend today. So that was pretty significant, I thought. Okay. And so these are events going on in the USA. Okay, in the 1850s to the 1900s. And I had talked last time about the whaling was in decline by 1830. Cranberries had found a home here in the late 1800s. But there were all kinds of reasons not to stay in West Falmouth. And a lot of our original settlers, families stayed here to maintain the farms by, at this time, were parceled out to any number of children. The families in West Falmouth, usually 8 to 10 children was not uncommon. And there just wasn't enough land to divide that equally. So a number of young people left for all of these different reasons. You can see we have a gold rush, we have the Civil War, we have the Homestead Act, we have the Alaska Gold Rush, the railroads meet, so suddenly the West became very popular. The Chicago Fire, I just put that in there because I can't imagine that in 1871 we would have 90,000 people homeless. So I just thought that was interesting. And then the National American Women's Suffrage Association. So there were all kinds of things that I'm sure that families living in West Falmouth were aware of. So you can see how interesting and how complex life in the US was. These are the occupations that you could find in West Falmouth or Falmouth between 1850 to the 1900s. Prior to this boom time, Falmouth and West Falmouth in the area have been predominantly an agricultural community. And then as industry developed, jobs developed. And so there were plenty of occupations if you were willing to leave agriculture behind and either train yourself or be trained, that you could support your family with. And these are just a few. The tag factory. The tag factory has, I would say undoubtedly, maybe, the greatest business venture in the history of West Falmouth for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was in existence for almost 50 years. And it was run by a woman for 40 of those years. Okay? So I'll let you look at the slide for a minute so you can understand why there was a need for these tags. So they were, predominantly women, were responsible for tying the strings, like on the tags that you have, and then shipping them back to the Denison Company in Framingham. But Matilda Denison, married to George Swift from West Falmouth, would come down here summers, she'd come down to visit, and she thought that the women here, there were so many men at this time just coming back from whaling or had found other occupations, that the women would be able to earn some money. And so Aaron left his company to his brother, or to his son, I'm sorry, E.W. Denison. That is his correct name, Eliphalet Wharf. No wonder he went by E.W., but he invented a shipping tag with a washer. So when you shipped goods across country or on boats, the tag would not rip off from the item. And so it was a very novel sort of thing in the late 1800s because it ensured that you would get the price you wanted for something that you shipped to somebody else. And this, Milt Williamson and I were trying to figure out, it may have been built on the back of the Boyce property. I saw a reference to it one place and I couldn't find it again. But this was, Bertha May had, hold on, I gotta get her name again. Gilbert, Annie R. Boyce ran the business out of her home. And then at some point, they built this as a factory for the women to meet at and do their work. So this is a slide of the women in a home, maybe Annie's, but they had tag stringing bees all over West Falmouth and other people's homes at the Methodist Church. And so they were paid 12 to 17 cents for 1,000 tags.
That looks like an inside road.
Does it? Yeah. And then one Davisville woman. So women came from far away. There were over 100 people employed in this tag factory. Actually strung 6,000 of those tags you have in your hand. Okay, in a day. So that's the reason for the tags. And now I present Susan Carlos.
Not much fanfare there. I am Susan Carlos. I washed ashore on Cape Cod about 30 years ago, but have only been in West Falmouth for about 5. And finding my new home right here in the library. And meeting with Mill Williamson and learning more about the history, maybe want to get more involved with this. So through some research, what I found was shipbuilding. Now, talking about shipbuilding in this very specific location on Cape Cod, of course it started out with the early Native Americans with canoes and small fishing vessels. The first, then the English settlers came in. The first registered ship was out of the Tuxet trading post, and that was for trade up to Boston and Plymouth. When you talk about Falmouth shipbuilding, it almost always means Woods Hole, because that was the only place with a deep enough harbor until they dredged in the very late 1800s. Early 1900s was the inner Falmouth harbor. But shipbuilding in Falmouth mainly was run by Elijah Swift. And my apologies for not having slides, but there are some good handouts as well. And Lois, did you put these together? And we're going to overlap a little because Elijah Swift, mostly what he was building the boats for was for whaling, but not always. So he's a very unique looking individual on your handouts with the eye patch and a pair of glasses over the eye patch, which I think was fun. To back up the big picture again, Falmouth didn't have a harbor, Woods Hole did. But there was also shipbuilding in Quissit, West Falmouth, and up in Megansett also. And we'll talk about the West Falmouth ones really specifically. But Elijah Swift was a carpenter by trade and a tree lover, and this ties into one of the things you have here. So he worked with wood. His big business, he started out traveling down south to gather live oak timbers. Live oak being very good in shipbuilding because it's weather resistant and pest resistant, so good for ships, but they didn't use it for plankings because of the funky way the trees branch. They used it for the knees and specific, my husband Glenn actually built ships on Martha's Vineyard, so I don't know a thing about ships. And when I show pictures later, I'm going to say, look at that pointy thing there. And he'll cringe. So the live oak timbers with the way they branch were good for the knees of the boats. So one of the interesting stories in the middle, right next to this picture, is when his barn burned, he went out to see if the tree next to it was safe, but I'm going to do a small contradiction on this. And it says it was a live oak. Those are southern trees. They did not grow on Cape Cod. What did grow is elm trees, and he planted the elm trees along the village green in Falmouth. And he went out to make sure his beloved elm tree was not burned because he could build another barn, but you can't plant another tree like that. So his boat building operations mostly were in Woods Hole, but I think he was the backer behind what happened in West Falmouth as well. Also, with the British Navy raiding the coastal areas, raiding the farms for their livestock and vegetables, but also messing with the ships and messing up with the. So he built a very large ship in his yard, which is by the current Falmouth Town Hall. And it's a very small picture, but it was a very large boat called the Status Antebellum, and it took a team of 50 oxen to tow it down to the water, and it launched from there. So he's importing live oak from the south and bringing it up. It is also used in making, I don't know, a slightly famous ship, the U.S. Constitution. So old Ironsides, and specifically, let me say Ironsides under sail, because the timbers were so strong, they say cannonballs bounced off of them. So that one we've heard of also. He did not build that, but it was native to live oak. So at one point, 2/3 of all ships built in Falmouth, most of it were built by Elijah Swift and his family, his operations. He had contracts with the U.S. Naval Department to build warships, and the live oak timber not acceptable, he kind of filtered back here to Cape Cod to use in the ships there. And many of his ships' names, Sarah Herrick was the first whaler built in Falmouth in 1830, but many of his names use Native American names for the ships. Pocahontas, Uncas, Awashonks, Ogamock, and also the William Penn. And he had an interesting relationship with the Native Americans in Mashpee, the Wampanoag tribe there, and also William Penn, as a Quaker, promoted friendships and good working relationships with the Native Americans. So there's kind of some overlap of why he named the ships for Native Americans. And there was also some issue of white settlers invading tribal lands in Mashpee to steal timber, which was probably being filtered back into the shipbuilding trade. So Swift had the Bar Neck Wharf Company in Woods Hole. He opened that in 1828. The ships were built there starting around 1819 and launched in from there. The height of the whaling industry was 1830 and was pretty much over by 1875. But West Falmouth Harbor, known more as Hog Island Harbor, used to be deeper. There was a hurricane in 1815 that blew the sand in and made it more shallow, but it was still in operation up through the 1830s, so it couldn't have wiped out the harbor till then. So there, I know there was another bigger storm that did make that harbor more shallow. But Solomon Lawrence was one of the main Hog Island shipbuilders and designers. He did build ships for Elijah Swift in West Falmouth and Woods Hole. He was the father of Captain John R. Lawrence. So all these, Lawrence and Swifts we're going to find all throughout all of Falmouth, especially West Falmouth history. The Swift brothers, the son of blacksmith Abiel Swift, who I'm sure was talked about in last times, the blacksmithing shop, which we can see from the window from here. The two sons owned the shipbuilding business in town and the chandlery to supply the ships in the harbor, and a store to sell what the ships brought in. And then for shipping out from Falmouth, the main products were wool, sheep, and cordwood. So it was used as a shipping port as well, but 11 seafaring vessels, 11 big ships. And here's where I will insult the ships. This isn't a brig. It's 2 masts. I can tell that part. Again, it's crazy. Also sloop rig and schooner rig. So these were whaling vessels. These were for international travel. They traveled through the Atlantic and Pacific, went down around South America and did a lot of the whaling in Pacific to Hawaii, the Solomon Islands. There were some fun run-ins with natives, which we cover on the whaling part. And they say with the Swift brothers, they said the stone building near the West Falmouth schoolhouse was the shop where the iron fittings for these vessels were made. So the stone building, of course, is the blacksmith shop. on Blacksmith Shop Road. So the whole family business was involved in different parts of the shipbuilding. And one specific ship, the second one on the list, the William Penn. It was built by Abner Hinckley, who was the major, Abner Hinckley and Solomon Lawrence were the two main builders in West Falmouth. So it was built by Abner Hinckley for Stephen Dillingham in 1832. It was a very successful whaler in the Pacific, shipping back many thousands of barrels of whale oil. But this was a bad luck ship too. On its first voyage, after successfully whaling, natives killed the first mate, captured a portion of the crew. The captain managed to get back, but he came home very ill and never sailed again. So they made more trips on the ship under different captains. The final trip, on November 26, 1847, the ship struck a reef on an island off the coast of Chile, broke apart and sank. The crew were saved and they did salvage some of the oil and sent back almost 10,000 pounds of bones, whale bones. They were able to capture these and send them back. But the ship is now lost. Quaker tradition notes that before the launching, it was predicted that the ship would be unlucky because too much Sunday work went into her. That ship was doomed from the beginning because, it did not follow the correct rules. The whaling industry died out, the need for whaling boats died out, the harbor closed up. But the main thing that changed the shipping trade and the need for building the boats here in West Falmouth and other places was the railroads. And as we learned on those whaling, when they left their home to launch out of New Bedford, I believe, they took the stagecoach out of town in 1871. 2 years later, in 1873, after they traveled around the world, they returned home by train. So the trains coming in eliminated the need for local ships to transport goods and opened up the area for the next adventure, which is tourism. Stay tuned, that'll be an upcoming one. Collect my mess and move on.
Next up, our salt works. We mentioned them a little bit in the first slide, but they were significant money makers. Almost every family had some sort of salt work perched on land they owned. Between Falmouth, West Falmouth, Quisett, and Woods Hole, there were 42 operations. Each had a rustic windmill for bringing water through wooden pipes into vats or into rooms for it to dry and crystallize. And this was happening the same time that men were still at sea whaling, men were still seafaring, whether they were captains or not. Oftentimes women, families would join husbands on whalers. So it was very difficult for people with salt works to find help. So it was farming that pretty much demanded 7 hours or 7 days a week and 24 hours a day. So remember the salt at $12 a bushel. It doesn't last. All right, so this is from 1837. I apologize, I just took a picture from a book for this one, so it's a little skewed. But we were producing that much salt. Yeah, 658 salt works on the Cape. 662,000 bushels of salt. And then in 1877, they found salt in upstate New York. And the Erie Canal had been completed in 1825. So then this is how the demand for Cape Cod salt declined. Was because of the canal was because there weren't as many whalers going to sea. And then, when the embargo of 1812 was listed, with all these other situations, salt fell to 40 cents per bushel. So almost all of the salt works were abandoned on the Cape by 1880. This is the process. I'll let you take a look at it because it's fairly fascinating. Nothing easy about making salt. 350 gallons of seawater for 1 bushel of salt. So these wooden pipes were laid underneath the water, far enough out to be able to pull in the gallons they needed. And at low tide, especially at very low tide, at Surf Drive Beach, you can actually see one of these wooden pipes in the water, is what they tell me. And then also, and Susan mentioned this, at Tuxet Trading Post, there are some foundations left from the homemade vats that you're supposed to be able to see there.
But none of this was table salt?
No, it was all, it was used primarily for preservatives. It was used for laundry, things around the home. I'm not sure when, that's a good question to write on your card, when it went from being sea salt to table salt. I'm sure it was used for, as a seasoning, but probably not the type of seasoning you sprinkle on your food. But I'll look it up. And this is the salt works in West Falmouth. Look at those names. We still have those names in West Falmouth. We've seen those names over and over again. And I gotta think that with men busy retraining, learning new jobs, that there were a lot of women and children. And our last salt works here in West Falmouth was abandoned in 1871. Okay. Remember the name Silas Swift. He had his fingers in everything in West Falmouth. Okay. Telegraph Hill. And Susan Carlos knows where this is. She can walk up there.
Next door.
Next door. A semaphore telegraph looked like this illustration. And it sat on top of Telegraph Hill, which supposedly is the highest point in West Falmouth. Is the fire tower still there, Susan?
No, there's
Okay.
no tower there.
Okay. There used to be a fire tower there as well. But a man had the job of, in the house, pulling down the pulleys in various positions. And if you look at this on the library website, all those little inscriptions are how those arms had to be to reflect one letter. So you can see how time-consuming it would be to send a message. But up until that time, they were sending flagged messages from hill to hill. And then when they invented the telegraph, they sent messages via this way. But between here and Boston, I think I said there are 6 telegraph stations on top of hills. All those hills are called Telegraph Hill. So don't ever GPS that, because who knows where you're going to wind up. And it only took 12 minutes to send a message from Quissit to Boston regarding ships that were coming around and through Vineyard Haven Bay, or Vineyard Haven Sound. That would be a lonely job, I would think. All right. With the train, okay, with the conversion to industry, a number of stores popped up. A number of whaling men who came home started grocery stores. The first one was started by Moses Swift, okay? And we've already heard about him and his operations here in terms of supporting the whaling industry. What was interesting about the Union store is that it was resident-owned, and they shared the profits. Okay. In the historical display cases that are around the corner, if you go out the back way, you will see a bill of sale from Lumbert Grocers, which was a Falmouth grocer, but I included it anyway because it shows the goods that Annie Moore paid for, and then at the bottom, it shows the goods that she sold to him, eggs and sacks and homemade things, and this was in 1889, and then her net bill. So that's how things were bartered and how things were traded in terms of groceries. The grocery market in the bottom right corner was Bourne's Market. It is now the West Falmouth Market. I'm continually surprised by the buildings that are still standing in this village that were built in the 1800s, and in the case of the Varmint Homestead in 1680s. Okay, brick kiln. People have searched for brick kiln, the kiln forever, and I read in two different sources that when the highway came in, it pretty much buried where this brick making operation took place. But this is a picture of Hosea, must be with his pet dog on the edge of the property. Colonel Edward H. Thompson. You must, when you get a chance, go to the link at the bottom and learn about his life. Somebody should write a book if it hasn't been written already. And I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to spoil the story. It is so remarkable, it is almost unbelievable. But he went to Mexico as an emissary for the United States, made friends with the local tribes there, especially the Aztec tribe, proceeded to explore Chichen Itza. Explore, by exploring, I mean exploiting, because he actually hired crews from Eastern Europe to rappel down the sacred well and pull out, first of all, skulls, and then body parts, and then utensils, and then they finally got to the gold and pulled it up, claimed it as his own. It's a fascinating story. So, and there's more pieces to it than that. And the kiln actually did make bricks. I just wanted to verify that. It was used for scouring, for sharpening. The bricks were not hardy enough to really be used in construction. They wouldn't last a long time. And there's our historic windmill, which served as a grist mill. It was in operation for a long time. It was built by Jesse Gifford, Bowerman Dillingham, and Richard Lake, who used to own the blacksmith shop before he sold it to Abigail Swift. And so Silas Swift, once again, here he is again, became owner in 1887. And I liked how he kind of was self-serving by arranging for carloads of grain to be unloaded in Wareham from the train and shipped down here before the railroad got this far. And the windmill went through all these ownerships, finally fell into disrepair in the late 1800s. And then it was sold to Dutchman Farms Ice Cream Company, just as a showpiece, and then burned down. So, but it's an iconic symbol of West Falmouth. The extension coming off the back there, 40 yards long. And so here are other views of the windmill, decorated for the bicentennial, and then looking at it as it sits over on land that was owned by Silas Swift, looking out to Chappaquiddick Island and Little Island Road. And Little Island's to the right, Chappaquiddick Island's to the left. And this village blacksmith, Susan talked about this, the deed for the sale of this, the blacksmith shop, and the acreage with it is on display in that archive case. So it goes all the way back to 1790, when Richard sold the land to Abiel. And so they provided all the services to the boats that were docking at whose Silas Swift. And just a couple of other pictures. The harness shop, C.O. Hamlin. You've heard about him, he was a whaler. Okay, once he got back from whaling, opened his store, like Susan said. And then we have Uncle Silas, the village carpenter. And also in the historical archive case in the back, We have a hatchet that was found on library property that dates back to 1860. And so it's just interesting to take a look at that. And that's on display. Then, 1872, the railroads changed everything. But there's a history with the railroads too. They were owned by competing companies. Eventually, it all became Old Colony. But at one point, all the way out to Provincetown, one point down to Woods Hole, and then you could go by ferry and pick up the railroad in Martha's Vineyard. Wouldn't it be nice just to be able to hop on a commuter railroad and go through the Cape today without running into traffic? I'll give you a little time to finish. And essentially, the railroad served two purposes. First of all, the sandwich glass factory, and then the guano factory. The sandwich glass factory employed over 500 people at one time, and the factory site covered 6 acres. There's very little left of it. And this is a picture of the station. And it sat where you parked for the bike path. So there's one picture where it looked like before cars, and the other picture after cars. Silas Swift was the station agent and the telegraph operator, because they were able to bring it down the hill, so Silas could do that too. And as you already know, he was the village miller. Mail was dropped off twice a day in the 1870s, either by stagecoach or eventually by train. The dude train. What a concept. It was a train just restricted to use of paying customers. You had to buy a membership, $100 for each member of your family, and then you had to pay the fare. But it would leave Neyland Station, now South Station, in late afternoon. So the men and families that were putting in a full workday would get down here in an hour and a half. And then they ran the train back on a Sunday. And that's the train, coal-powered steam engine. And I was surprised that it lasted as long as it did, 1884 to 1916.
Is that an annual subscription or not?
Yeah, 100 per person per year.
Per year?
Yes. Yes. Well, there were a lot of industrialists in Boston with a lot of money, and you're going to see a little bit of that money in a few of the homes that I'm going to show you, because this all gave rise to a migration of wealthy people from Worcester and from Boston down here buying property and summer homes. And it really kind of changed the whole nature of the Cape, and especially West Falmouth. That's the Woods Hole Terminal in 1902. That's where you pick up the ferries now. I mean, it was all railroad tracks, and I imagine they had to be able to turn the engines around or reroute the engines in order to make the trip back. But then, once you got on the ferry, there were 8 miles of trains at the Vineyard. And I'm sure it probably took you from Vineyard Haven to Edgartown. And here's Catamount Station. I don't know if anybody's here from the area. I don't know if that's still standing.
Yes, it is.
It is. Okay, thank you, Peter. Is it still a station? Is it a house?
It's being used now by, I think, some artist group, the Art Center.
Oh, wonderful. Okay.
The Artist Center, Falmouth Art Center.
Oh, so it's located there
Yeah.
by the tennis courts.
No,
No?
about a quarter of a mile before you get to the tennis court.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Right by the post office.
Right
Oh, all right. And this was a train at Neyland Station. And those are the stops it made. Anybody know Tempest Knob?
Is that the knob? No.
No, it wouldn't be.
No.
And this was before the canal, so maybe it
Yeah.
was a stop on the other. The rest of them, I think most of us in here know where those are located. But you couldn't get a ticket on this train. unless you had paid first and been a member. Okay, and then of course, we were keeping carpenters busy here, building homes, building meeting houses, 3 of them, and building churches, 2 of them. So this is the Quaker Meeting House, and this is at its final location. Okay, it was built first of all in 1720, up the hill at the end of Friendship Way. There was a trail from Sandwich to Falmouth that ran along the side of the glacial moraine. And so the main road into West Falmouth was that trail. And so that's where the first meeting house was built in 1720. But they had a cemetery up there in 1685. And so if you park on Old Stagecoach Way down here beyond the market and you turn right if you're going this way, there are all kinds of trails up there that will take you to those locations, and some stone fences. We were talking about farming in the last presentation, and there's one stone fence that ends in a creek. Linda Okagawa mentioned what the creeks were used for shelter and other things. So there's a lot to see on those trails. If you haven't been up there, you should take the opportunity to do so. And so this is as it was in 1841 at its present location. I'm sorry. This is what it looked like in 1794 at its present location. And then it was raised and rebuilt in 1841. And that's the first Methodist Church. Okay? On land donated by Silas, Eldred, Eldon Crowell Construction. Charles Carter was one of the first pastors. But then in 1900, there was a problem with the church roof, and so they rebuilt across the street. Yes, Bill?
Silas Elder is my great-great-grandfather.
Wonderful. Yeah, so he donated the land for the church, the initial land. And it's still, the church itself, the 1857 church, is now a home next to the West Falmouth Market. It wasn't raised.
No, across the street from the current church. Right
Yes, straight across, yes.
Actually, it's just north of the old Union store,
Okay, so this structure still stands.
minus the top.
Yeah. And then the church was rebuilt in 1907, rebuilt in the early 1900s. And the mortgage finally paid off in 1907 because the village came together and raised the funds. So there were a lot of itinerant professionals in the area, and preachers were prevalent. Okay, so to begin with, it was difficult to keep a preacher full-time in a church, first of all, because there wasn't a whole lot of money to pay them to support a family. And so these are a list of all of the pastors at the Methodist Church in their history. But I love the story Virginia Landers, who's still living and is the official church historian, provided at the bottom. I think it's just the cutest thing. I'll give you time to make sure you can read that. We'll have to get Virginia here and have her explain that. So Quakers, leaders, and preachers, the same thing. It was difficult to keep somebody here to lead the Quaker fellowship. And with the Quakers, you don't need to have a leader because everyone is considered equal in terms of, finding the pathway to God and that sort of thing. But it helped keep the membership together if there was somebody there in place. I thought it was interesting that in the 1800s, women in the Quaker Church were as equal as men when it came to decision making. And from what I can see, they still are. Okay. But then in 1902, the Smith family were very dedicated Quaker families here in West Falmouth. But by 1902, people had begun leaving, for new jobs, new places. And so it was difficult to keep the congregation together. Sometimes it just met in the summer times. and other times just sporadically. So they finally had somebody come down to lecture, and he was able to hold the meeting together, and not only that, but draw people from the area to come and listen to his lectures. He was very well respected. So village schools. 1850, Falmouth had 9 schools. West Falmouth had 5 of those 9 schools. Remember those big families I talked about? Yeah. So this is not a picture of district school number 6. This was the last school. All right, this one had indoor plumbing. But I think it was just for water, because I think I can see an outhouse off there to the right. Okay. So this is the modern building in 1887, according to Cecilia Fugelister. And the schools, 3 of the schools were built right on from the blacksmith shop. I just put that in there. This is not 1850 to 1900s, but I love the picture. It was taken at about 1910. And then I love what the Falmouth Town Report of 1873 said about teaching. So I'll give you a minute to read that too.
Right?
Yeah.
I believe in the back row, the 1, 2, 3rd from the left is either my mother or one of her 2 sisters.
I knew there'd be somebody here that might know somebody in that picture, and I was thinking it might be Milton. Yeah, look at how they're dressed though.
They all look
She's
very
one
sturdy.
They do look very stern, don't they? And unfortunately, the teacher's face is blurred. She's probably sternest of all, I gotta think, if her kids look that stern. All right, and I love the way Leslie McDonald from the Falmouth Preservation Alliance worded this, because she talks about the advent of the trains and the tourists. And I love her quote, "With the train in 1872 came the curious, the adventurous, and the investors. And it was a time of livery and delivery." Okay. Now, because of that, a number of West Falmouth families boarded people in their own homes. Okay, so from 1870 to 1900s, seems like everybody was able to find a room and people to stay. The Hamlin House, they had a number of houses that they would let to tourists coming in the area. And I know that Falmouth doesn't get as far as Quisset, but Quisset, I think, was probably the first property to operate as a hotel in Falmouth. Okay, it started when a number of tourists would come down in the 1860s. And then by 1874, Colonel Lewis was running the place as a hotel. And what I find surprising now is that Stephen Carey purchased the property in 1881 from the Lewis family. And then they deeded the property both at Bourne Farm and down at Quisset Harbor to the Quisset Harbor House Land Trust and the Salt Pond Area Bird Sanctuaries. The house is still being used for special occasions. And this is the plots that were laid out at Chappaquoit. Okay? So you can see some were granted than others. Surprise, surprise, they belong to the first investors. And the way this actually developed, it was almost sort of a private affair. Once the plots were laid out, then the 2 investors, there were actually 3, and I'll talk about that in a minute, let all their friends and families know that plots were available. And so Charles H. Jones was an initial investor. That was his house in 1891. And then I think I referred to Samuel King as Henry King before. I apologize. Samuel King was the other major investor in 1892. And one was a pharmacist and one was a shoe manufacturer. And then Everett Edward Fraser or Fraser, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, was not family or friend with either King or with Jones. And so he built his house on top of the glacial moraine. Okay, just up here at Blacksmith Stop Road and to the right. And he was president of the Fall River Steamship Line. And it was going to be a clubhouse for this wonderful golf course that was to be built up there, and the golf course never materialized. So Silas Swift, oh, did you have a question, Peter? I'm sorry.
No, your comment about I learned from another lecture
Yeah.
you've done recently. There was a small golf course up there where the highway is now.
Oh, yeah, it might be. What was it, I'm sorry?
9 holes.
Oh, it was 9 holes.
Yeah, there's Fairway Drive and a whole bunch of other.
Oh, are a result of that. Okay, all right. I guess when I said it never developed, it never materialized, was not at the grand scale that they had hoped it would.
I think it was too hilly.
Yeah, I would think so.
I might be told.
Yeah. Silas Swift, he was the only local citizen to grow wealthy because of development. He owned most of the land from Route 28A down to the harbor, and then up across the bridge on Nashawina, and then all the way down to Chappaquiddick. And so now we're looking at all of his lots across the water from Long Point, and 10 of 11 lots were developed by 1908. And so and you can see some of the houses. The builders, what Silas wanted was a colony to resemble what the gingerbread house colony over in Martha's Vineyard. And so as you drive past some of these properties between here and the harbor, you can see a few still that have retained that gingerbread look. Okay. Henry Kingman, all right, that's where I was confused with my king and my Kingman. He was a shoe manufacturer, and he bought this lot from Silas Swift in 1890. And the harbor house there is still standing, the house is still standing. And then once again, we get Silas Swift's credentials. Okay, so you don't see the front of the house, but you see the back. And what was I don't know if that other property still sits there or not, I have to take a close look. And then the Kingman Boathouse. And then the Sarah Skull House, you've seen this. This is the home of the College Light Opera. Okay? It was built or designed in 1895. And for the Skull family who sold it to Harvard professors, who sold it to Mrs. William Montgomery. And she ran it as the inn. And in the 1970s, Hosea K. Lilly, who was a benefactor to all of Falmouth, purchased it specifically for the College Light Opera as a boarding house. And now we are wailing and almost the conclusion, so Lois, if you would come up here, please.
This is really going backwards from where Renee has been, because she's been through the training course, and now we're going back to the period before that, which is the period when there was a lot of whaling. And on the first page here, you can see the names up top of ships that were built in West Falmouth there. The Magnet, the Meteor, the Phoenix, and so on, including the William Penn, the Marseillais, and the West Falmouth. At the side there is one captain and some mariners who went out from whaling from West Falmouth. And at the bottom left are the names of the other captains, of course, Bowman's, Giffords, Hamlin's, Hoxie, Wicks, and Swift are the last names that we're very familiar with now. So those are all people from West Falmouth that went whaling. And above, of course, is Elijah Swift with his eye patch, and about the live oak that was used for whaling. Right now, the only whaling ship that's left is the Charles Morgan, which is at Mystic Seaport, and was restored several years ago, and they sent to the southeastern United States to get live oak to restore the Charles Morgan. So that's still important for whaling ships because it holds up so well. And you can see on the back of that Caleb Hamlin was dragged down underwater and partially swallowed by a whale that managed to survive. And so he's called a Jonah, because apparently that happened fairly often enough. And you can see down below, the Commodore Morris had 7 boats chewed up by a whale. So, and it was a very dangerous thing. Not only were they gone from home a long time out at sea and went to sometimes dangerous places, the women at home had to take care of absolutely everything while they were gone, with no communication and not even any assurance that the men would come back. Down at the lower part of that second sheet, you can see Mrs. Cordelia Childs of North Falmouth was the first white woman to go ashore in Japan and stay a while without paying the death penalty. And she went sailing with her husband, as several of the women did. And on the back you can see a humpback whale, and you get an idea of how huge it is from that picture. And then some more vessels that were built at Falmouth and Woods Hole. And you can see in the logbook picture how they, in their log, they kept track, usually always, of the weather, and also the whales that they saw, and the whales that they captured, and the number of barrels of oil that they got from those whales. And they also sold the whalebone. And at the bottom there is a picture of Bertha Boyce, who went out with her father, and that was the Bertha goes whaling that we talked about before. And the whole idea of that was how dangerous it was. The Native Americans, when they went whaling, basically they took boats out and they drove the whales in towards shore, and the whales beached themselves, and that was how they captured them. Later, when they went out in ships, and the fewer whales, the further they had to go. So they went all around the world into the Pacific and everything. What I'm going to read to you is a story about Silas Jones and what he went through. And it's amazing, the danger and pain and suffering of it. So this is a sailor who was on the ship of Silas Jones. My next voyage, it was in 1833 aboard the ship Awashocks. That voyage made history in the form of one of the bloodiest massacres ever perpetrated aboard a whaler. I signed on as a boat steerer. We headed for the Pacific Ocean in search of sperm whales. The voyage was uneventful, and after several unsuccessful cruises, we ran northwest from Tahiti. This cruise bringing us oil, we stopped at a number of islands near the King's Mill group. We had captured 3 whales, and when we were passing among the islands, the wind fell and left us becalmed. The natives came out in great numbers in their little canoes to trade. They were very friendly, and we bought quite a number of things. On October 5th, when we were in approximately the center of the South Pacific, we sighted an island dead ahead and decided to run for it. 3 canoes containing 4 or 5 natives came alongside to sell plantains and coconuts. The natives were allowed on board, and we tried to converse with them, but without success. After their coming aboard, the captain ordered dinner and went below with a couple of officers, leaving the 3rd officer, Silas Jones, on deck to keep watch and to shoot the sun. The natives appeared frightened at the sight of the shiny quadrant and seemed to look upon it as an instrument of warfare. Dinner over, the captain came on deck to see many other canoes full of natives approaching. The number of natives on our decks increased to about 30 or so. They seemed to pay a great deal of attention to the ironwork. Now, a native will steal anything if he thinks no one is looking, so it amused me greatly to see a couple of them grab a hold of an iron eye bolt in the deck and pull like blazes to get it out. The eye bolts were fastened into the crossbeams, and I don't believe an elephant could have budged them. The captain, noticing their interest in iron, opened a box containing about 15 polished cutting-in spades. to gratify their curiosity. A cutting-in spade is a triangular-shaped piece of steel, sharpened like a razor, mounted on a long pole, and used in stripping blubber from the whale's carcass. Shortly after the spade exhibition, the natives appeared to become excited. Suddenly, 2 or 3 made a rush for the spades. Having secured one, they beheaded the captain. And soon spades and all movable objects were flying thick and fast. The last man to remain alive on deck was Silas Jones. He escaped by killing one native that got in his way and then jumping through an open hatch into the forehold. Most of us were in the forehold, prisoners since the natives held the upper decks. As we were discussing our situation, Jones jumped in. He started at once to break his way through the wall in an attempt to reach the store of ammunition. He managed to secure some muskets and ammunition, which we immediately got ready to use in a try to regain our ship. The natives were howling and yelling and dancing on the deck when our muskets spoke up the companionway and one lunged forward on his face. The firing drew the natives aft. Each time we fired, they threw something in return. Sometimes a harpoon and sometimes a spade. It was one of these that hit a man named Lewis and severed one of his knee joints. He died later from his wound when gangrene set in. Nearly all of the men left were sorely wounded. Jones was the only active one left. Dragging us forward to safety, he took a keg of powder aft where most of the natives were. Placing the keg in the companionway, he ignited the fuse and blew the natives gathered just above sky high. This was the last straw for the natives. They couldn't stand before the explosives. Those remaining alive leaped into the sea and were hurried on their way by pot shots. 6 of our number, including our captain, our first and our second officers, were dead. Jones now became captain and appointed another boat steerer and me, first and second officers. If it hadn't been for Jones, I guess we'd all have died. Being the most active, he patched us up the best he could, and with those wounded the least, sailed the ship to Honolulu. I was the last to get well, and I owe my life to Captain Jones. I had a violent pain below my shoulders and didn't know what it was. Captain Jones looked it over but said nothing. He knew that mortification had set in next to my spine. Mortification calls for amputation, but in my case it was impossible. So he decided to try burning. One night as I lay asleep, I suddenly awoke to find myself lying in my bunk on my face, stripped to the waist and bound. The captain then applied a red-hot iron to the affected part. The operation, though excruciatingly painful, was short and effective. We arrived home sometime later, and I have never been to sea since. So I think that kind of sums it up. And that's why you see the people that did come back home quickly going to other ways of earning their living and not looking forward to going back. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, and we leave you with John Dillingham, because why did you talk about mentioning John Dillingham? All right, and this was not Falmouth Village, but whatever village you're a part of in the area is coming together. You know, when something in the village is needed, you come together and you support it. And it was interesting, John Dillingham was a dedicated Quaker. But I love the way he supported the Methodist Church and talked about how good the people were that were a part of the building and donating. But I especially love the quote in the middle that explains why he thought the Methodist Church was so good for the village. Keep in mind that Quakers have been here for a long time and have been meeting for a long time at this point. And next month, we are having a talk about important Quaker women in West Falmouth, and that will be followed by an open house across the street at the meeting house. The talk itself, I think, is scheduled for 10:30, And it's last Saturday in May. Oh, I'm sorry, in March. It is March, not May, it's March. We're trying to have something every month. And then hopefully I can coordinate with Harriet Crocker for the Methodist Church. And we can do something there as well. Because I think it's important that you appreciate the institutions, not only the buildings they live in, but the history of the institutions in West Falmouth. It gives you a better idea of, you know, where families came from and what kind of place you're living in. So thank you all for coming. Next one, we have